This video is for the man who has noticed something changing but hasn't put a name to it. Not a dramatic change, not something that happened overnight, just a quiet, gradual dimming of something that used to be reliably present. The interest, the energy, the drive that, for most of your adult life, you didn't have to think about because it was simply there. If you're over 60 and you've noticed this, here's the first thing you need to understand. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. The Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, one of the most comprehensive long-term studies of male health ever conducted, reported that approximately 19% of men over 60 have testosterone levels significantly below the lower limits of normal young adult males, with testosterone declining at an average rate of 3.2 nanograms per deciliter per year from the fifth decade onward. The European Male Aging Study, surveying over 3,300 men across 8 European centers, found that the prevalence of symptomatic late-onset hypogonadism, the clinical term for age-related testosterone decline, increases steadily from the sixth decade, with the most significant rise occurring between ages 60 and 79. A longitudinal study tracking men across decades estimated that approximately 50% of men in their 80s have total testosterone levels meaningfully below those of healthy young men. Testosterone decline in aging men is not a personal failing. It is a documented, well-studied biological process, and it is associated, consistently across the clinical literature, with reduced libido, reduced energy and vitality. But here's what the research is increasingly clear about. The rate of that decline is not fixed. It is not simply a function of how old you are. It is substantially modifiable by what you eat, what you consume regularly, that may be accelerating the hormonal decline that otherwise would have been much slower. There are 3 specific dietary categories, all supported by published clinical evidence, that appear to meaningfully contribute to testosterone suppression and reduced sexual drive in men. Not through vague mechanisms, but through specific, documented biological pathways that we are going to walk through clearly today. Before anything else, this content is educational information, not medical advice. If you are experiencing significant changes in libido, sexual function, energy, or mood, these are symptoms worth discussing with your physician. Low testosterone is diagnosable and treatable. What we are covering today is the dietary dimension of a larger conversation you may need to have. Let's begin. Food category 1, ultra-processed foods. This category deserves more than a casual mention because the research behind it has recently become significantly more precise. In 2025, a randomized controlled trial published in the journal Cell Metabolism, one of the most rigorous publications in the field of metabolic science, conducted a direct, controlled nutritional comparison between an ultra-processed diet and an unprocessed whole food diet in male participants. This was not an observational study asking people to recall what they ate. It was a controlled crossover trial, meaning the same men were fed both diets in sequence, with a washout period in between, and measured comprehensively throughout. The findings were direct. Compared with the unprocessed diet, consumption of the ultra-processed diet caused a decrease in follicle-stimulating hormone levels and a trend for decreased circulating testosterone levels. Sperm quality also trended toward a decrease, with reduced total sperm motility in the excess calorie arm. The researchers noted that these effects were independent of caloric load, meaning the hormonal disruption was not simply a consequence of eating more calories. The ultra-processed nature of the food itself was detrimental to metabolic and reproductive health. To understand why, you need to understand what ultra-processed food does to the hormonal machinery of the male body at the mechanistic level. The first pathway is insulin resistance. Ultra-processed foods, packaged snacks, fast food, frozen dinners, sweetened beverages, processed meats, commercial breads and pastries are characteristically high in refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and industrial seed oils. These ingredients drive rapid, repeated spikes in blood glucose, which the pancreas responds to with surges of insulin. Over time, and with repeated exposure, cells throughout the body begin to resist insulin signals, a state called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is directly linked to testosterone suppression through multiple mechanisms: impaired function of the Leydig cells in the testes that produce testosterone, altered signaling in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis that regulates hormone production, and increased visceral fat accumulation. That last mechanism leads to the second pathway, adipose tissue and aromatase. Visceral fat, the fat that accumulates around the abdomen and internal organs, which ultra-processed food diets promote more than almost any other dietary pattern, is not metabolically inert. It is metabolically active tissue that expresses an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase is responsible for converting testosterone into estradiol, the primary estrogen. The more visceral fat a man carries, the more aromatase activity is present, and the more of his existing testosterone is continuously being converted into estrogen rather than remaining available as testosterone. This is why abdominal obesity is one of the strongest predictors of low testosterone in aging men, and why dietary patterns that promote visceral fat accumulation are directly relevant to the hormonal balance equation. The third pathway involves endocrine-disrupting compounds. Ultra-processed foods frequently come in plastic packaging and contain a range of synthetic additives, emulsifiers, preservatives, and flavor compounds that are classified as endocrine disruptors, chemicals that interfere with the body's hormonal signaling systems. The cell metabolism researchers specifically noted that some of the hormonal disruption they observed may come from the plastic packaging itself and from the chemical additives characteristic of ultra-processed formulation. These compounds can bind to hormone receptors, alter gene expression in endocrine tissues, and disrupt the precision of the feedback loops that regulate testosterone production. The dietary shift toward ultra-processed foods has incurred numerous adverse effects on metabolic and reproductive health, characterized by chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. Men's fertility and hormonal health are markedly affected by obesity and diabetes, with processed food intake being a key driver of this pattern. The practical translation is this: every meal that comes from a package, a drive-through window, or a freezer bag is, at some level, a choice that works against the hormonal environment your libido depends on. Not once, not occasionally, but as a dietary pattern, day after day, year after year, it systematically degrades the metabolic conditions under which testosterone thrives. The replacement direction is straightforward, even if it isn't always convenient. Whole foods, meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruit, legumes, whole grains, and healthy fats in their minimally processed forms. Foods that contain the zinc, magnesium, vitamin D, and healthy fats that testosterone synthesis directly requires. The evidence for this is not ambiguous. Food category 2, alcohol, specifically as a habitual, regular consumption pattern. Let me be precise about what the evidence actually shows here, because this is an area where nuance matters. A single drink at a social occasion is not what the research identifies as problematic. A glass of wine with a weekend dinner is not the issue. This is the pattern that the hormonal research consistently links to suppressed testosterone and elevated estrogen. The mechanism is multi-site and documented in detail. In the pituitary gland, alcohol can decrease the production, release, and activity of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, two hormones with critical reproductive functions. Additionally, alcohol can interfere with hormone production in the hypothalamus. This means alcohol disrupts the hormonal cascade at its source, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, before testosterone is even produced. Less LH signaling means the testes receive a weaker stimulus to produce testosterone in the first place. At the testicular level itself, alcohol exerts a direct toxic effect on the Leydig cells, the specialized cells responsible for testosterone synthesis. Excessive alcohol consumption damages the testosterone-producing cells in the testes. This direct gonadotoxic effect is independent of the hormonal signaling disruption occurring at the hypothalamus and pituitary, meaning alcohol is attacking the testosterone production system from multiple directions simultaneously. And then there is the aromatase effect. Alcohol stimulates aromatase, the enzyme that mediates the conversion of testosterone to estradiol and androstenedione to estrone. Consequently, in addition to decreased testosterone production, higher than normal percentages of testosterone are converted into estrogen in habitual drinkers. This increased conversion may account for the elevated estrogen levels and abnormal breast tissue enlargement observed in some heavy drinkers. Research in animal models found directly that chronic alcohol ingestion resulted in increased hepatic aromatase activity, elevation of plasma estradiol, and a decrease in plasma testosterone levels. The cumulative result of these mechanisms, regular alcohol consumption suppresses testosterone from the top of the hormonal cascade, damages the cells that produce it, and simultaneously accelerates the conversion of whatever testosterone remains into estrogen. For a man in his 60s whose testosterone is already declining at a physiologically normal rate, this triple mechanism hormonal disruption from nightly drinking creates a compounding effect. The natural decline accelerates, the estrogen-testosterone ratio shifts in an unfavorable direction, and the subjective experience is exactly what you'd predict: reduced drive, reduced energy, reduced interest in intimacy. The research on alcohol's effects on estrogen and testosterone is reflected in a 2024 meta-analysis published in Andrology, specifically examining chronic alcohol consumption and the gonadal axis in men. The findings were consistent with the mechanism literature. Chronic alcohol consumption is associated with measurable disruption of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, reduced testosterone levels, and altered estrogen metabolism. There is an additional dimension worth naming for this audience specifically. Alcohol disrupts sleep architecture, particularly the deep, slow-wave sleep stages during which the majority of testosterone's daily pulsatile release occurs. Research has consistently documented that testosterone levels are highest in the morning precisely because of the overnight secretion that occurs during quality sleep. Alcohol, even at moderate doses, suppresses slow-wave sleep, which means that the nightly drink intended to help you relax is simultaneously degrading the sleep quality that your testosterone production depends on. The compound effect of nightly alcohol consumption on male hormonal health after 60 is not a small thing. It is a daily hormonal insult layered on top of an already declining baseline, and it is entirely modifiable. Food category 3, added sugar and refined carbohydrates, consumed chronically as a dietary pattern. This category overlaps mechanistically with ultra-processed foods, but it deserves its own detailed treatment because added sugar is present in many foods that people don't think of as particularly unhealthy. Flavored yogurts, breakfast cereals marketed as wholesome, sports drinks, fruit juices, condiments, coffee shop beverages. The cumulative daily added sugar consumption in the average American diet is far higher than most people realize, and its effect on the testosterone libido axis operates through some of the most well-documented mechanisms in endocrinology. The primary pathway runs through insulin. Every time blood glucose rises sharply, which refined carbohydrates and added sugars reliably produce, the pancreas releases insulin to manage it. A single acute spike is not the problem. The problem is the chronic pattern of repeated, high-amplitude insulin responses over years that characterizes a diet high in added sugars. This chronic insulin excess eventually produces insulin resistance, and insulin resistance is directly hostile to testosterone production. The mechanism has been studied and replicated. Insulin resistance impairs the function of Leydig cells, which depend on insulin signaling to operate optimally. Impaired Leydig cell function means impaired testosterone synthesis. Additionally, insulin resistance tends to promote the accumulation of visceral fat. And visceral fat, as we established in the ultra-processed food section, expresses aromatase and accelerates the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. Research on the acute relationship between sugar ingestion and testosterone provides a specific and striking data point. A clinical study measuring testosterone levels in men before and after glucose ingestion found that testosterone levels dropped by an average of approximately 25% within 2 hours of a glucose load and remained suppressed for several hours afterward. For a man whose testosterone is already on a declining trajectory, chronic consumption of high glycemic foods and added sugars means a significant portion of each day is spent with testosterone levels acutely suppressed below their already declining baseline. There is a second mechanism through the inflammatory pathway. Added sugars, particularly fructose in high concentrations as found in high fructose corn syrup and fruit juice, drive systemic inflammation through the production of advanced glycation end products, the activation of inflammatory cytokine pathways, and the promotion of a metabolic environment characterized by elevated triglycerides, impaired lipid profiles, and increased cardiovascular risk. Chronic systemic inflammation is independently associated with suppressed testosterone levels because the inflammatory cytokines that characterize this state, particularly interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, directly interfere with the testicular cell machinery that produces testosterone. The third mechanism is body composition. A diet chronically high in refined carbohydrates and added sugars tends, over years, to shift body composition in the direction of higher fat mass and lower lean muscle mass. Fat mass, particularly visceral fat, expresses aromatase. Lower muscle mass is associated with lower testosterone, and the cycle reinforces itself. Lower testosterone promotes fat gain and muscle loss, which further accelerates testosterone decline. The practical translation for this audience: the chronic daily pattern of sweetened beverages, regular sodas, juice, sweetened coffee drinks, is particularly impactful because it delivers large glucose loads multiple times per day without the fiber, protein, or fat that would slow their absorption and blunt the insulin response. Switching from sweetened beverages to water, unsweetened tea, or black coffee is one of the highest leverage single dietary changes available for anyone concerned about their testosterone and metabolic health. The same logic applies to the refined carbohydrate foundation of a typical breakfast: white bread, commercial cereals, pastries, bagels, which delivers a high glycemic load first thing in the morning, immediately suppressing the testosterone that was naturally highest from overnight secretion before the day has even begun. Now, let's bring this together with the specificity and directness this topic deserves. 3 dietary categories, 3 distinct and documented biological mechanisms, all 3 operating against the hormonal environment that male libido and vitality depend on, and all 3 operating at greater impact in men over 60 precisely because the hormonal buffer has already narrowed with age. Ultra-processed foods disrupt testosterone through the insulin resistance pathway, through visceral fat accumulation and aromatase upregulation, through nutritional displacement of the zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D that testosterone synthesis requires, and through direct endocrine disruption from chemical additives and packaging. The 2025 Cell Metabolism randomized trial provides direct experimental evidence that the ultra-processed nature of food, independent of calories, is harmful to male hormonal health. Habitual alcohol consumption disrupts testosterone through the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, through direct Leydig cell toxicity, through aromatase stimulation accelerating testosterone to estrogen conversion, and through suppression of the slow-wave sleep during which testosterone's daily pulsatile release predominantly occurs. These mechanisms compound each other and compound the natural age-related decline. Added sugar and refined carbohydrates disrupt testosterone through chronic insulin excess and insulin resistance, through visceral fat accumulation and aromatase upregulation, through systemic inflammation from advanced glycation end products and pro-inflammatory cytokine activation, and through the acute hormonal suppression that follows high glycemic glucose loads. None of these are abstract or theoretical. They are measurable, documented hormonal mechanisms that operate in the bodies of real men every day. What is also true, and this is equally important, is that all 3 are modifiable. These are not genetic predispositions. They are not irreversible damage. They are dietary patterns. And dietary patterns are choices that can be changed incrementally and sustainably in a direction that gives your hormonal system a better environment to work in. If you address nothing else in your diet this month, reduce your daily added sugar, replace sweetened beverages with water and unsweetened tea, reduce processed food frequency by replacing 2 or 3 packaged meals per week with whole food alternatives. If you drink alcohol every night, experiment with 3 or 4 nights per week instead and observe what changes. These are not heroic interventions. They are gradual, sustainable shifts in the hormonal environment your body is working with every single day. Before you do anything else, have a conversation with your physician. If the changes you've noticed feel significant, a simple blood test measuring total and free testosterone, SHBG, LH, and estradiol gives your doctor the information needed to assess where you actually are on the hormonal spectrum and what the appropriate next steps are. Diet is powerful, but it is one input among several, and clinical evaluation gives you the full picture. If this video gave you something specific and useful, subscribe. We cover men's health after 60, the biology, the evidence, the practical steps, every week. And if this is a conversation you've been having with yourself quietly, share it in the comments. More men than you'd think are asking the same questions. Stay informed, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.